Good evening, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I, along with many of you in the audience, are located is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. As we organize around anti-racism and decolonization, we recognize the ways in which our presence on this land upholds colonialism and reproduces dispossession and violence for Indigenous people. For those of us who are settlers, we commit to working and learning more about how we can prioritize upholding conditions of the treaties that govern this land. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the final lecture in our very successful Davidson lecture series in Religion and Public Life, supported by the Edgar and Dorothy Davidson Fund in Carleton's Religion program and produced by Carleton's MA program in Religion and Public Life. This evening's lecture, which will be introduced shortly by my colleague Kim Stratton, is made possible only through the amazing support of staff members in the Office of the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. So I'd like to thank especially Emma Fraser and Ainsley Coghill for putting together the advertising and registration page and for setting up and running this webinar. They've been editing and posting the previous lectures in this series as well. So if you missed out on any of those, you can still view them online. I'm going to put the URL in the chat in a minute. The current lecture will also be posted on this site sometime in the next week or two. So if your internet cuts out or your baby needs feeding or your computer crashes in the middle of tonight's lecture, you'll still be able to go back and watch what you missed. Lastly, I'd like to thank Johannes Wolfart, the coordinator of our MA program, for all of his efforts and support in helping me put this series together. He'll also be moderating a Q&A for us after the speaker has finished her presentation. So if you have any questions during or after the presentation, please go ahead and type them into the chat. Professor Wolfart will collect them and pose them to the speaker on your behalf at the end. And now I'll turn things over to my colleague, Kim Stratton, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Hi. It is with immense pleasure that I introduce Reverend Dr. Gay Byron for the 2021 Dorothy and Edgar Davidson Lecture. This lecture was generously endowed by the late Edgar Davidson, who completed a master's degree in the religion department after retiring from a career in law. His endowment was intended to foster intellectual exchange and deep reflection on topics related to the study of religion. This year, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of our MA program in Religion and Public Life, we looked for a scholar whose contributions to the study of religion have powerful reverberations in the public sphere and found the perfect candidate in Reverend Dr. Gay Byron. I first met Dr. Byron when we were graduate students in New York City, and she was completing her dissertation on racialized imagery in early Christianity, which was subsequently published by Routledge as Symbolic, Blackness, and Ethnic Difference in Early Christian Literature. At that time, Gay was a commanding presence in the department and set a high standard for junior members like me, who looked up to her as a model of intellectual excellence, professionalism, and collegiality. After completing her PhD, Gay continued to model academic excellence through her scholarship, teaching, and service to the discipline and wider community. I will briefly describe her accomplishments and contributions in those three areas. Dr. Byron's work on the discursive use of racial imagery, specifically descriptions of ethnicity and color differences in early Christian writings, is pioneering in its rigorous interrogation of ancient discourses and stereotypes that contributed to and continue to authorize centuries of racial bias and othering. Her book, Symbolic, Blackness, and Ethnic Difference, has been described as, quote, distinctive for the rigor of its methodology and the stirring challenges of its critiques, and launched Byron as a formidable force in biblical studies. Building upon this solid foundation, Dr. Byron has published on Ethiopian Christianity, race and gender in biblical studies, as well as co-edited Womanist Interpretations of the Bible, Expanding the Discourse, which was published by the Society of Biblical Literature in 2016. Dr. Byron's commitment to teaching and passion for addressing issues of race and gender in the classroom are evident in courses she's developed, such as images of ethnicity in early Christian literature and biblical theologies, liberation and womanist approaches. She has also been instrumental in raising the profile of Ethiopian studies in the Academy through her teaching, publications, and collaborative partnerships that have taken her around the world, from Munich to Warsaw and Addis Ababa. Byron has also risen to leadership positions, most recently Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Howard University, where she enlists her experience and dedication to bring about institutional change. Dr. Byron's CV is replete with evidence of commitment to the community, both to the community of scholars to which she belongs, as well as to the community of faith as an ordained Presbyterian minister. In academic service, she's active in leadership positions and committees with the Society of Biblical Literature, and has led early career workshops for the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Theology and Religion, and was instrumental in developing the Thurman King School of Black Church Leadership at Colgate Rochester Divinity School, among many other things. In service to the community of faith, she continues to preach and teach in the Presbyterian Church, wherever she lives, and frequently speaks out for social justice and on behalf of racialized communities. For example, she has published open letters to former President Trump and to the presidents and deans of theological schools regarding problems of race and racism. It is with pleasure and anticipation that I cede the virtual podium to Gay Byron, whose talk tonight, More Than Symbolic Blackness, Race and Ethnicity in the Bible and the Public Square, promises to take us beyond her foundational and groundbreaking work on race. Thank you. And thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Stratton. And as you indicated, we go way back to graduate school days at Union Theological Seminary and Columbia University. So just hearing you survey all of this activity, I was wondering, wow, I've been pretty busy over these past couple decades. So it is such a delight to be with you all this evening for your Davidson lecture series on religion and public life. I want to extend gratitude to Professor Shauna Delansky, Professor Stratton, Professor Johannes Wolfark, and also Emma Fraser for helping coordinate behind the scenes the technology that has made it possible for me to be in Canada by way of Washington, DC. And to all the planners and sponsors who have envisioned this lecture series and brought it to fruition, I certainly consider it an honor to have this opportunity to spend some time with you focusing on race and ethnicity in the Bible and in the public square. So what I want to do tonight is share some slides with you. And I will do that at this time so that you can see, as Professor Stratton has noted, my focus is on more than symbolic Blackness, race and ethnicity in the Bible and the public square. So in this lecture, I will offer some comments about my understanding of symbolic Blackness and ethnic difference in early Christian literature. This may be new to many of you in the audience, so I do want to just give an overview of that thesis and that book, focusing specifically on two stories in the book of Acts. The baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch, and also behind the scenes, there's Kandake there, and also the story of Paul, who was mistaken for the Egyptian in Acts 21, verses 27 to 39. I will then discuss the Aksumite Empire of the ancient Ethiopians, the kingdom of Meroe, and the subtle ways in which discussions about ethnic others in the Bible lead to racialized readings and limited access to the full plethora of people and places in biblical and extra-biblical literature. And then finally, I want to get at the heart of this lecture by raising the question, how do you teach about race and ethnicity in the Bible? And then how can these insights be used to open a broader conversation about the role of biblical narratives in helping us address the current landscape of racial injustices in the US and also in Canada? And so in other words, the question is, how do we take the Bible beyond the classroom, beyond the pulpit, and into the public square? Racialized discourses saturate the media, political processes, policing practices, and virtually every strata of US society, including the church. Until recently, readers of the Bible would not have taken seriously the ways in which race and ethnicity are constructed in biblical narratives, and furthermore, how these images impact not only their interpretations of biblical stories, but also their own understanding of contemporary racism as played out in everyday life. For most readers, the biblical past is disconnected from the ways the Bible is used in the present. And part of the reason why there is such a disconnect between ancient readings of biblical texts and contemporary realities of persons reading these texts is due to the fact that biblical scholarship seeks to focus on rendering an objective, unbiased, historical critical reading of the Bible in its ancient context by using methods and theoretical constructs that keep the reader outside of the interpretive loop. Thus, if one can apply methods privileging historical, literary, textual, and other aspects of interpretation that illuminate the ancient context of a particular passage, then presumably the interpretive work is done. However, there are many contemporary factors, such as social location, cultural background, ideological and political commitments, economic realities, gender differences, sexual orientation, and other constructs of identity that highlight the distinctive experiences of particular readers and bring these experiences inside the interpretive process. So I first began my inquiry and research into understanding ethnic difference in early Christian writings by examining ethnic and color-coded language associated with Egyptians, Ethiopians, Blacks, and Blackness in Greek and Latin Christian sources from the 1st to the 6th centuries. Although there are many positive examples of Ethiopians in Greco-Roman literature in general and Christian writings in particular, the preponderance of negative depictions led me to theorize about a type of ethnic othering that is operative in the sources. And so I developed a taxonomy of ethno-political rhetoric that shows that in spite of the basic contention that Christianity was to extend to all people, even the remote Ethiopians, from a review of ethno-political rhetoric, it appears that certain groups of Christians were marginalized and rendered invisible and silent. They were, in the words of Jerome, blackened by their sins. Now, this was not necessarily done because of the color of their skin or their ethnic identity, although on the surface, the narratives sound as if this is the case. Rather, Egyptians, Ethiopians, and Blacks symbolized And symbolized is the operative term. They symbolized those within Christian communities who were more than likely marginalized because of certain ideas and values they held that differed from the more dominant voices within the community. Thus, ethnic and color difference came to symbolize certain theological, ideological, and even political intra-Christian controversies and challenges. So just to give you a couple of examples of this, I want us to look at Acts 8:26-40. And this may be, of course, a familiar text to most of you, but this is where Luke narrates a vivid story of a baptism of an Ethiopian eunuch. And as the story goes, an angel spoke to Philip and summoned him to go south along a wilderness road from Jerusalem to Gaza. And while traveling, Philip ran into an Ethiopian who was a court official of Kandake, a queen of the Ethiopians. He was returning home from Jerusalem, and while seated in his chariot, he was reading scripture from the prophet Isaiah. It was Isaiah 53, verses 7-8. The Spirit told Philip to go over to the chariot and join it. When Philip ran up and heard the Ethiopian reading from Isaiah, he asked, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And the Ethiopian replied, "How can I, unless someone guides me?" This question opened an opportunity for Philip to interpret the scripture and to proclaim to the Ethiopian the good news about Jesus. And as they continued to travel down the road together, the Ethiopian spotted some water and jumped out of the chariot and announced, "What is to prevent me from being baptized?" So he commanded the chariot to stop, and both he and Philip went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. And after this, the text says at verse 39, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away. The eunuch saw him no more and went on his way rejoicing. Now, New Testament interpreters generally view this passage as a fulfillment of Acts 1, verse 8, which declares Christianity is to extend to the ends of the world. Yet after this dramatic baptism scene, the Ethiopian, the Queen Kandake, the kingdom of Nubia from which he traveled, and the other people who may have witnessed this encounter disappear from the narrative as Philip is snatched away and the Ethiopian rides off in his glory, rejoicing. And this is not the only time that a person connected to Africa disappears in the book of Acts. John Mark, Acts 12, verse 12, Acts 13, verse 13, and also Acts 15, verses 36-39. Known as the one who takes the gospel to Egypt, that's John Mark, he also disappears from Luke's narrative after a dispute between Paul and Barnabas. After the disagreement in Acts, which we find in Acts 15, as to whether John Mark could continue with them in their travels, nothing more is said about John Mark, nor the teachings he spread throughout Egypt. And as a result, based on Luke's story in Acts, readers are left with the journeys of Paul around the Mediterranean as the primary lens through which to understand the development of early Christian communities. Now, in addition to the famous Acts 8 text of the Ethiopian eunuch, there's also Acts 21. And given how John Mark disappeared from the narrative, it's very interesting that Luke places Paul in a scenario where he's mistaken for the Egyptian. And so in Acts 21, verses 27 to 39, Luke provides a striking episode that took place during Paul's visit to Jerusalem. The Jews from Asia, threatened by Paul's presence and his association with Trophimus, the Ephesian, stirred up the crowd to the point of dragging Paul out of the temple, beating him, and even attempting to kill him. According to Luke, all of Jerusalem was in an uproar. Josephus, in the Jewish Wars, depicts the Egyptian Hol Aegyptios as responsible for inciting riots and leading 4,000 men into the wilderness. And so I've argued that Paul was treated in this text as a foreigner and a political insurrectionist. Paul's mistaken identity as Hol Aegyptios, the Egyptian, was intended to communicate much more than a discourse about ethnicity and the Bible. In fact, nothing that I was reading at the time dealing with ethnicity enabled me to understand why Luke would set up this story by using what sounded like an ethnic slur. Why did Paul have to be distanced from the Egyptian associated with bandits in the desert or the wilderness? Why did Paul affirm himself as a Jew from the important city of Tarsus in Cilicia and ask whether he could speak Greek? The interplay of ethnicity in this passage led me to theorize about the rhetorical, symbolic meaning of this scene for advancing Luke's storyline about Paul. So this is how I got into this whole enterprise about ethnopolitical rhetoric and trying to understand symbolic Blackness. So then the book is published and I go out and I start sharing this material with my students and in other settings such as divinity schools and religious studies courses, and also in churches and in community groups. And I would invariably receive the question, what do we actually know about the Ethiopians during this time period? Or have you looked at Ethiopian sources? And unfortunately, at that point, I was limited to the Greco-Roman sources I had been exposed to during my coursework and exams. And thus, these questions stirred up for me, what about the other side of the story? What's going on in these narratives about Egyptians, and especially Ethiopians and Blacks? And so once Symbolic Blackness was published, I realized that made a wonderful thesis and it was highly regarded and this, that, and the other, but it didn't quite get at the essence of what I was hoping to understand is why were the early Christians so absorbed with the Ethiopians in the first place? And so in order for me to get to that, I continue to do more research on ancient Ethiopia and the New Testament. And I had to dig deeper into the ethnic context. Here's one depiction of that Ethiopian eunuch story, right? Doesn't look very African to me, sitting in that chariot. So I had to start raising questions about the ethnic context of this passage, but also the racialized subtexts that are embedded in this narrative and many other narratives within biblical and extra biblical sources. And this forced me to become much more intentional in my research around Ethiopia itself. And And so every time I talk about this material, even trying to get at race and ethnicity in the Bible, it's important that we situate ourselves in a land, in a place where there were people and there was culture and there was language. And so I've moved on to focus on the ancient Ethiopian empire known as the Aksumite Empire. And if you can see my cursor, Aksum is in the northern part of Ethiopia, and it encompassed what is known as the Tigray region and included even Eritrea and also a small portion of Yemen across the Red Sea. And here's another image of the Aksumite Empire, just so you can get a feel for Aksum and its proximity to Nubia and its orientation around the Red Sea, with Adelis here being the major seaport of Aksum. And so I just had a whole shift in my frame of reference. How do I understand what was going on among the Ethiopians? Where did that Ethiopian eunuch presumably return? Or where did he come from? Who is Candace or Kandake? And that's what led me up the Nile River, as you can see, and into the world of the ancient Ethiopians, also known as Nubians, depending on which text you're working with. And so for tonight, I want to just focus a bit on the Aksumite Empire, just to put some names out there for you all. Frumentius and Odysseus are the Syrian youth who are credited with bringing Christianity to Aksum, and the Emperor Ezana was converted to Christianity, or took on Christianity, if we don't want to use the language of conversion, adopted the Christian practices, if you will, during the 4th century, presumably around the same time as the Emperor Constantine in the Roman Empire. Now, strange enough, I had no clue about all of this material when I was working on Symbolic Blackness, because as you can see, my orientation was around the Roman Empire and not in the Mediterranean Sea, and not the Aksumite Empire and this Red Sea. And also, when I introduce Aksum, I always like to call attention to the language that was used in Aksum, and that is known as Ge'ez. Of course, many of you who work with Semitic languages, you already know about this, but once again, I wasn't introduced to this in my own particular program. Ge'ez is ancient Ethiopic. This is the Fidel, or the alphabet, that I'm putting up on the screen for you all, just so you can see. It's a Semitic language, syllabary with its own unique characters and vocabulary. And it's the still used in Orthodox Christian churches today. So you can actually hear Ge'ez in Orthodox services. But I was not introduced to all of this because, as I indicated, the general orientation for studying the New Testament and early Christianity is around the Mediterranean Sea, with just the northern part of Africa, as it is included in the empire. So we don't drop down south enough on that wilderness road that the Ethiopian eunuch was on to even get a feel for what was the context, what was the background of the Ethiopian. And because of this, we end up with images like the one you see on the screen here, where everything is pretty much Europeanized. This is an image from Sunday school curriculum back in the 50s and 60s. I'm not sure if we would find curriculum like this today, but this was a well-established image of what the Ethiopian eunuch would have looked like. And so just to shift the images and get a dark-skinned depiction of the Ethiopian, and to see others who were in that whole court of this Queen Kendake adds a whole new, fresh level of understanding what's going on in these biblical narratives. And furthermore, as I have continued with my work on this Ethiopian eunuch story, it has become obvious to me that it's important to understand who were the Kendake. It wasn't just one queen. There was an entire lineage of queens in the Meroitic kingdom of Nubia. Okay, and so I'm just listing this. There's a lot of scholarly debate about which of the Kendake is the one mentioned in Acts 8. Here, this third one, Queen Amanatare, is considered to be the Candace or the Kendake of Acts 8, okay, during that time period, 25 to 41 CE. But some scholars also would refer to this Queen Widamak, who may have also been the Kendake mentioned in Acts 8. So this is some current scholarship that I am working on to begin to, as I like to put it in this other essay I'm working on, to begin to say their names or say her name. Just having Kendake listed in a story that features the Ethiopian eunuch is just not enough. And so I am pushing beyond those boundaries and trying to find ways to expand these stories and get a broader picture of the leadership, the different cultures, the different types of economic activities and political realities that were going on in these particular texts. And so here's just a slide. We don't need to go through all of this, but doing this kind of work gets into how I began to teach about race and ethnicity, but also how important it is to not just talk about race and ethnicity in abstract terms. We must center ourselves in a particular land, in a particular people. And as Professor Shauna Delasky opened up with her introduction tonight, just acknowledging that we're on land that we settled into, and in some cases violently took over from other people, is very important. And likewise, for understanding Egypt and Ethiopia in the Bible, it's important to be able to say their names, acknowledge the places, the people, the Queen of Sheba. We won't go into all of these details because and we can have more discussion about this in our Q&A, but I want to especially talk to you about how I teach about race and ethnicity. You see these maps of locating Nubia, lower Nubia, upper Nubia, understanding that what we call Nubia in antiquity is modern day Sudan, with the capital of Khartoum here. It's all, and look at the proximity to what I've already indicated as the Aksumite Empire. You see that? And so when we think about the movement, and here's Meroe, when we look at this map of Nubia, this is the place where the Ethiopian eunuch presumably came from, Meroe. And so it's important to be able to recognize the many names for Ethiopia. So even trying to do this kind of scholarship, and not to mention trying to bring it into the classroom, forces us to do a lot more historical work as biblical scholars and even as students. I know this lecture series is focused around MA students and your own particular focus on religion and public life. So how do you get at taking what is in an ancient biblical text and moving it into the classroom so you can actually have some real substantive conversations, but then getting it out beyond the classroom? How do you teach about this material? And the way I was able to teach about it was to actually take some time to go to a Wabash colloquy where I specifically focused on the pedagogy of talking about race and ethnicity. Because for me, of course, as an African-American woman, and probably not so, of course, or obvious, but for me, I can't ignore race and ethnicity in my hermeneutical inquiry. I can't ignore my gender reality as a Black woman in America, as I do biblical scholarship. And that's what has led me into this kind of womanist hermeneutic, womanist biblical interpretation, because for me, it seems obvious that we have to take into account our own identities, our own experiences when it comes to reading biblical texts. As I said at the outset of this lecture, there tends to be a disconnect that you check your skin at the door, or you check your skin at the study carrel, or wherever your library is where you're studying. And then you go in and do your deep research, pulling out all of those historical critical methods. But you as the interpreter matter. And that's the foundation for doing what I would call racial, ethnic, biblical criticism. It is pulling into the frame, if you will, who you are. Even as you're using tools, you're constantly checking what are the questions you have about a text? Why is this important? And how do you unpack any biases or privileges or racialized subtext that you may be bringing to the interpretive process? So I did a lot of reading on critical race theory and just tried to understand how so-called minoritized readers of biblical texts, how we do it, and what's different with Anglo or white or European readers of texts. And I was able to actually take a close look at how I taught my introduction to the Gospels class. I just want to draw an example here. So I had my students actually do some presentations on racial, ethnic criticism, and every student in the class had to name their ethnic identity. Not just the African American students, not just the Asian American students, not just the Latinx students, but every student, every interpreter of the Bible comes with an ethnic lens. We can't escape it. It's the skin we're in. And putting our skin on the table, putting our skin in the interpretive process makes it much more robust It makes it much more authentic, and it helps to open up transparency when we're reading biblical texts. But as I was trying to teach this to my students, what I found is that the burden for talking about racism and racial experiences, the burden always fell back to the African-American students. They were the ones having all of these stories about what happened to them, how they were pulled over when they're driving, how when they go into department stores, they're stalked and followed, you know, as if they're gonna just walk out with everything in their jackets without paying for it. And then my white students, you know, they would kind of sit back and take in all of these stories. And they just focused on basically the historical critical methodology piece and didn't quite understand or have a way of unpacking their white privilege. Even though I had assigned to all of the students Peggy McIntosh's seminal essay on the invisible knapsack of white privilege, for some reason, the students just could not find a hook into that. They couldn't find a way to begin to talk about it. And so that's how I have learned over time that until we find a way for every reader, every interpreter, every student, when you're coming to a sacred text of any sort, not just the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible for that matter, I would argue that a starting point has to be naming your own ethnicity, because in that way, then you begin to have something at stake. You then begin to read deeper and have a need for going into more experiences, understanding different lands and different people, even getting to know the different classmates that you're studying with. Oftentimes we keep it, you know, things are shifting a bit now because we can't avoid racial discourses the way we used to be able to avoid them. Because I know where I live, every day, every hour, virtually every minute, there's some reminder of the racial injustices that are just permeating in the country I live in. You all will have to kind of sit with how this translates in your own Canadian context, but we can't ignore this material now. We can't skirt around it and say this is somebody else's responsibility. If we don't do it, who will? And I'm talking to my colleagues now. I'm also talking to students, those of you who may be considering graduate studies or even social advocacy work or nonprofit leadership, philanthropy, whatever the case may be that has brought you to Carleton University or whatever school you may be enrolled in right now. You want to really ask yourself, what are you trying to get out of this experience? That's why I really wanted to work with that question. How do we teach about race and ethnicity? And then how can these insights be used to open a broader conversation about the role of biblical narratives in helping us address the current landscape of racial injustices in the US and also in Canada? So, you know, we can list all of the biblical texts, you know, we can do all of this. But the real question for me, and I hope the real question for you and why you all have this Davidson lecture series focusing on religious life in the public square, is how do we take the Bible beyond the classroom, beyond the pulpit, and into the public square? So you see where this lands me. Black Lives Matter Plaza, 16th Street and H in my city, the District of Columbia. And what's in the background there is St. John's Episcopal Church. I'm sure many of you all remember June 2020 when the president at that time overtook the crowd of protesters with tear gas, horses, and other means to clear Lafayette Square Park for a photo op in front of St. John's Episcopal Church, holding the Bible, upside down, of course, but nevertheless, the Bible as a prop, symbolic Bible, if you will. What are the implications of talking about race and ethnicity, or even having all of this new scholarship about race and ethnicity, because there are just so many new wonderful studies. Everybody can comfortably talk about it. I had a conversation with a young colleague, a new colleague in the field just yesterday. He's working on a project, decentering whiteness. So even within biblical studies, you know, we've had all of our various studies about race and ethnicity, and now there's even a movement toward decentering whiteness in biblical studies. What does that mean, though? What does that mean when we're still using the same methods? We're still using the same maps, narratives about the Greco-Roman Mediterranean world. What does it mean when we actually haven't grappled with all of the marginal characters in the biblical text? And what does it mean when this is the cleaned up scene after the aftermath in June 2020? Everything now is all fenced off and barbed wired off. But what does it mean to take our biblical teachings, education, rigor, Professor Stratton, right? What does it mean to take all of these tools that we have, this wonderful theoretical scholarship? How does it land on the street corner? Just want you all to sit with this for a minute and just kind of think about it. This is Black Lives Matter Plaza. I was down there protesting the day after, wrote a piece about it, you know, all of those kinds of things. But I think it takes more than the one or two op-eds or the 1 or 2 days that we're able to go out and lift the Black Lives Matter signs. We have more of a responsibility, those of us called to this scholarly endeavor, to find ways to really live out the rhetoric we proclaim, right? These are some images that I actually took in my own, just being out and about. And I want you to just, as we're closing the lecture now, I'm taking it to the public square, if you will. You know, this whole question, how do we take the Bible? I'm going to say it again. How do we take the Bible beyond the classroom, beyond the pulpit, and into the public square? George Floyd, of course, the trial for Derek Chauvin is going on, you know, day number 4 now. Painful, painful. Not even a full year ago. Ahmaud Arbery, these are images I took of the ones who are to be remembered. You know, as I do my own scholarship, you all will find your own inspiration or your own what's at stake when you do what you do. This is it for me. These are not professional photos. This is Professor Byron walking around the public square. Trayvon Martin. So there were just hundreds of pictures after one of the Black Lives Matter protests during the summer of 2020 with the youth. Trayvon Martin. Tamir Rice. Tamir Rice. With the dates. Breonna Taylor. These are just what was attached to, you can see the fence there. And I just walked up and down the block, around the block, peering into the fence, the barbed wire, looking at St. John's Episcopal Church, cleared out now. Worshipers can't even go there now. Say her name, Anna Brown. You know, some of the names we know, right? Her life was taken September 21st, 2011, Anna Brown. Taisha Miller. Sandra Bland. And I left this image the way it is when I was putting together my slides for this evening. I was like, oh, I should try to find a cleaner, more professional image. But this is what my eyes saw. And what it says to me, I filled it out because we see her life was taken July 13th, 2015. It says, say her name, Sandra Bland. But if you can see, the image is blurred out there. And I think that's actually quite symbolic of what's at stake in this type of scholarship around race and ethnicity. If we don't find a way to keep these names at the forefront, keep these racial realities, the just systemic, horrific forms of hate and violence that are continuing every day. You know, I can hardly even keep a list now. I could have done, as I was putting this together, I could have done just an hour lecture just calling out all the names of those whose lives have been cut short. And so we in religious studies, we in divinity schools, whatever your location is, professionally, vocationally, socially, economically, whatever the case may be, when we talk about the public square, what does it mean for you? What I had to do today, it meant that I went back through some old pictures. I found them and I took them and I put them in a place where they can bear witness to why this one particular scholar is called to doing this kind of work. We must say their names. I have to call out the name of Kandake. Another image, all the names here. So many, so many. And as I come to a close, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, on a sobering note, but we're in the public square now, right? So it calls for some moments of reckoning. And so, you know, I've lived with this whole notion of Black Lives Matter day in and day out. I have 2 college-age sons that every time they walk out the house, you wonder if they'll make it back. Even when I walk out the house, I kind of wonder if I'm going to make it back. But Black Lives Matter in Canada too. Right? This is not just a US thing where, oh, they're just so obsessed about all of this. No, it matters where you are too. And in my own research, understanding your context, there are 5 chapters, Black Lives Matter chapters in Canada. The first one was established in 2014. Back in November of that year, thousands of activists staged a rally against police brutality. And they were protesting the September shooting death of Jermaine Carby, say his name, by a police officer in Ontario's Peel region. And they were also protesting the decision by a Missouri grand jury. You know, we're neighbors, we're all in this together. The grand jury not to charge the officer who killed Michael Brown. Ferguson, remember? Seems like ancient history now. See, we got to start remembering where are we on this timeline here? The Toronto rally was spearheaded by activist Sandy Hudson. And shortly after, she founded the Toronto chapter of Black Lives Matter with Janaya Khan. And in July of 2015, Black Lives Matter Toronto organized a rally protesting the deaths of Jermaine Carby and a Sudanese immigrant. Now, right, we were just talking about Nubia and the Sudan, a Sudanese immigrant, Andrew Loiku, who was shot by Toronto police on July 5th of 2015. You all know these stories, and your stories are what? Not so different from my stories. And our stories are not so different from the ancient stories where Paul was gang mobbed and beat up and about to be killed because they thought he was the Egyptian who was known for starting riots in the wilderness. See, these are the stories that I guess were supposed to not be told, but we find readers like myself, and I'm sure readers like you in this audience, who know that we have a responsibility to tell the whole story, all sides of the story, present all the evidence. And it's in that way that we can begin to have some meaning from this work that we do, this ministry we do, this study we do, however you want to call it, it matters. And so on that note, I think I'll close out this lecture, and I welcome your questions, and I welcome an opportunity for some conversation around this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Byron. I would like to start by asking the entire audience to join me virtually in thanking Professor Byron for a talk that was by turns enlightening, heartfelt, and challenging. And before the questions start, maybe I would respond to that challenge by saying the name Abdi Rahman Abdi, who was a fellow citizen of Ottawa and who died in this city, not far from where we live and work, and whose killer was not convicted. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
And now I'd like to invite people in the audience to pose questions, since you've kindly agreed to answer questions, correct? But right now the chat is all lit up by thank yous. Thank you. Thank you very much for this. Thank you, incredibly powerful. So wonderful, powerful, and moving. Thank you for the amazing lecture. Thank you. Thank you. Very long string of thank yous. No questions yet.
I think we need to sit with it for a minute.
Yes, I think you're
You know
right.
what I mean? That was the other piece about the pedagogy. You know how you make assignments and you think, okay, they read this in a week and then we come and we're able to talk about it. I realized that it doesn't just flow like that. There's a process with the engagement when you're working with such emotionally charged material. And I've been looking at this material for years now, and it's still, even in my own preparation, it's still just, it takes something, it just draws something out of you. But it also calls us into standing up for those who are not able to even be here, or those who are not able to stand up for themselves. You know, we have all kind of immigration issues going on, children. I mean, it can, all of this morphs into so many implications. I think that's what I want us to think about. It's not I know how to do racial ethnic criticism now. My toolkit is complete. It just doesn't work like that. It's like bringing your skin into the game, and everybody's skin matters. So I just want to just welcome us to just have like a moment of just silence, to just take it in, to breathe. You know, there's so much I can't breathe. 8 minutes and 46 seconds in front of our faces. So we dare to breathe. We dare to center ourselves. We dare to stay with this. Find ways to ask the questions, even if we don't have the answers. Just raising the questions opens up new possibilities. So thank you, Professor Wolford. Go
Thank
ahead.
you.
Mhm.
So I have a question that has been posted. We're ready. Question is from a colleague, Adele. And the question is, do you have strategies for getting your white students to eventually, she says, see how their whiteness shapes how they approach the New Testament?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and that's where we need the readings and the scholarship on whiteness, and those are in the works. And that's why I cited that forthcoming, it's going to be a double volume coming out by Samaya Studies on decentering whiteness. But one of the ways that one of the things I can do already with white students and colleagues is to peel behind the facade or the boundary of whiteness, because it actually does present a boundary. And just have someone say, well, where'd you come from? Who are your parents? When did they come to Canada, or when did they come to the US? What city in Poland? What place in Germany? Where in France? You know, I love the stories. And that's one way, Adele, to get our students and our colleagues to start to shift the lexicon so that we're not looking for the exotic other to carry the burden of doing this work. But everybody, so in my images of ethnicity, an early Christian writings course, we start out giving an ethnographic biography of who we are. Every student has to go back and trace the family tree. And if they don't know, they say they don't know. And that's how we start. So Adele, that's one way. There are some new books. I have a couple here. Willie James Jennings, he talks about after whiteness. and education and belonging. These are some of the works I'm currently reading in terms of how do we get the whole guild of biblical scholarship to move along with this, so you don't just have one or two renegades out there trying to do this stuff, and it's considered fun elective courses. But my goal is, how do I integrate this into introductory biblical studies classrooms, where an incoming student, a first-year MA student, a first-year MDiv student, even in doctoral programs and seminars on theory and methods, you're introduced to how to talk about race, ethnicity, whiteness, privilege, power. I don't think I've said that word tonight, but we have to put that on the table. There's another book in terms of Christians, and there may be some others for other faith traditions, but this book is by Carolyn Helsel, 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 and it's helping white Christians talk faithfully about racism. So I do a lot of work in church communities and with lay persons about this. And the title of the book is Anxious to Talk About It. Anxious to Talk About It, helping white Christians talk faithfully about racism. We all know of Ibram Kendi's work on how to be an anti-racist, right? We'd have a whole different conversation on how to work with that. His binary on either you're racist or anti-racist. I have some concerns about that. But there's a lot of literature out there about the topic now, but what's important is that we figure out how to actually use it. Not just to be able to cite it and say, okay, I have Kendi on my syllabus. I have Byron on my syllabus.
My understanding is that Peggy McIntosh's work goes back to the 1980s. So in that sense, that's part of the historical textual record by now.
And it's an accessible essay.
Yeah.
And that's what I assign to my intro students. And still, there's something that has to be done to kind of chisel away.
So the questions are now coming.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't mind, I'll ask another one related to biblical studies specifically. And the question is, have you applied any of this analysis to Septuagint and pseudepigrapha, or if not, are others doing it?
Yes, it can be done. I haven't specifically had the time to actually go into it, but the ethnic othering happens. It's a rhetorical, it's a literary strategy of how you take others and use them as tropes. So it's a literary methodology that applies to any body of literature, not just even ancient literature. So you can use it in that way. I don't have actual citations for the pseudepigrapha now, but I want to say there's some who have done it. I can follow up on that to see if I can send something back to you all.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So another question. I was wondering if you could speak to the situation of AAPI hate going on in the US right now, also in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
How does that intersect with the discussion of Blackness in the Bible and within the Christian church? Have you encountered similar instances of the marginalization of Asian voices in the history of the church?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's the same phenomenon. And that's why the whole notion using the rubric of ethnicity works, because it can happen to any particular group depending on who's in power and who is telling the story. You see that? And so in terms of the Asian American community, you run into the same types of things that are going on in terms of the ethnic othering with Blacks and Africans in the Bible. So Jin Young Choi is one Asian scholar, Choi, at Colgate Rochester Divinity School, who has done a lot of work on minoritized. So the way you'll see the scholarship pitched are these minoritized readings of the Bible. And that's an umbrella term to pick up not just persons of African descent, but Latinx, Asians, and any other group for that matter who is not in the mainstream or in the dominant sphere of power.
So there's a follow-up question that relates very closely to that. And the question is, do you think ethnic othering would, in religious texts relates to white missionary work? So this is the, how does this intersect with missiological?
And that's where we get into what are the implications of acknowledging that Christianity was already in Africa and started in Africa before the missionaries came and brought their guns and the Bible to the Africans. And so this actually undermines the whole impulse of missionology, mission studies, the whole way of training that you go to a place where people are empty vessels and they need to be saved and rescued from whatever practices they have been putting in place and living with. And it's especially just relevant for the continent of Africa, because the very way we came to this country was a forced religion imposed on us, and the same religion used by the white master was to be the religion that is to help the African slave endure the bondage. So you see the two-edged sword there. So my argument or my suggestion, I don't want to argue about it, I just want to suggest that let's just shift the whole frame of reference altogether and go back to the beginnings and find additional sources. Understand that there were Nubian queens and African kings carrying on commerce, handling their political disputes. They didn't need someone coming in there showing them how to do this. If we shift that frame of reference from modernity back to antiquity, and still we got to peel back all the layers of power and, difference. And just because something is African doesn't mean it's going to be perfect, if you will. But at least we get to put the experiences on the table. At least we don't have to think that, oh, we didn't have anything until the missionaries taught us how to believe. Okay, I could go on and on with that, but I think you get the point. It's a matter of shifting the frame of reference. And by doing that, it actually kind of implodes the whole missionary ethos, if you will.
Can I interject a question of my own as a modernist?
Yeah.
Because you have sort of suggested that it's a choice between modernism and Eurocentrism and antiquity studies. Where would you place the work of our late colleague Lamin Sane, who is both interested in modern history, recent history, and historically grounded, not strictly theological Afrocentrism?
I found Sane's work very helpful in my own understanding of world religions and African religions. It is a very helpful framework for knowing that we can't just toss out any of these buckets that we have. And that's why I deal with the whole notion of ethnic context and racialized subtext, because it means we have to go back and peel all of these layers through each historical period, and also within each interpreter. That's the whole post-colonial spirit of biblical interpretation. The interpreter is not left off the hook.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it was an eye opener when I came to understand through his work.
Yep.
That you have to always ask, which Bible and which public.
There you go.
Or you've fallen down before you've taken your first full step.
Thank you for saying his name, the late Lamin Sane. Yes.
So back to the questions really are coming now. Please let me know when you've had enough. We're keeping you very, very long. I hope you don't still have duties because it's Maundy, Thursday. But how do you reconcile, this is going back to the very personal tone that you bring. The question was, how do you reconcile the need to raise your voice with the emotional burden it puts on you to do the work?
Yeah, that's how we have to ask ourselves, how do we stay in this for the long haul, right? And Professor Stratton talked about how we first met 20 years ago as students. And here it is now, life goes on, and the same types of issues that were at stake 20 years ago are now even more heightened. Because at that time, I was just reading about all of this violence against Ethiopian women, in these ancient texts. And there was a semblance of, okay, it's not that bad. But once, you have these stories of Sandra Bland, this shift over the past, okay, we can see what happened over the past 4 to 8 to 10 years. There's just the white supremacists are just unraveled. I'm just going to have to say that. And so we have to take care of ourselves in doing this work. And it's important that we build coalitions and true collegial partnerships so that we don't do this work alone. And furthermore, and I know the president of SBL, Adele Reinhardt, has, initiated the Black Scholars Matter initiative. I just want to say that, because it also takes some institutional accountability in this work, so that I'm not the only one feeling the pain of what I have to see when I turn on the news every night, or what I see when I open up the Washington Post, day in and day out. And so the emotional toil is real. There are days when I turn the media off. I can't take it. You catch up the next day in the same loop. So, but I turn it off, and I take some time to get some sunshine and sit by some still waters and breathe. I truly mean that. I've leaned more into spiritual practices over these past several years now. I'm a part of a faith community where I can also be held accountable in that regard. All of these things for me are necessary for this type of scholarship that takes time. I've been talking about symbolic Blackness to the point where I'm now at. It's more than symbolic Blackness. There's more at stake. And I can say that there are examples of it now. And so then as we get more and more students and more colleagues who are taking on this work, so it's not exceptional, it's just what we do, Professor Wolfert, it's just what we do. For those in the audience, this is what we're called to do in this season. Yeah. So thanks for asking that.
So I we still have questions, but I'm mindful of the fact that I've just asked you about exhaustion and then am pressing with more
Take maybe
questions.
one or two more. Will the chat
Can
be
you still
saved?
hear me? My internet has gotten unstable as well.
Okay. Can the chat be saved and we can follow up in some kind of way?
Yes, the chat will be saved.
Okay, that's good.
There are some more questions, but I think it's probably best if we
Wow. I
wrap
just
things
opened up the
let
chat
you,
box. These are rich
go
questions.
with our thanks.
Yeah.
There are more questions, but they're getting very long, and the evening is becoming long for you. I guess I would, if I'm hearing you correctly, while you started with the question, how do we take the Bible into the public square, and you ended with the question of responsibility of the Bible scholar, and would it be right to say that really that responsibility comes from the public square, that the issue of going to the public square is resolved by a responsibility from the public, or from quite literally from the square that gave you those pictures, those images. I wonder if whether we want to converse on that now it's probably not the time to converse, but whether the to and from issue needs to be addressed one more time, that the times where scholars thought their calling was to give has passed in some significant way this year.
And so there's something to gain from what we're hearing in the streets. Yes. And it's not that we're trying to give to others how to do this, but perhaps we can learn from the activists and from the blood on the street, from the voices crying out to be heard. That I appreciate your framing of that. And it's a two-way street. And so that we end up on the street corner. Yeah.
So yeah. Kim has just asked that I take one more question. Somebody's been posting us, and it's a long question, but if you'll bear with me, I won't take the last word, but I'll give it to Eamon, who asked this question. Within the spectrum of scholarly work, how does someone who is white that is interested in doing foreign international work discover the history and make interconnections with Western history without appropriating another culture or taking away recognition from the country of interest? And he goes on to say, I want to be able to travel the world and explore histories that are not Canadian, but perhaps because of white guilt, I feel as though I may be restricted to what I may be able to explore without reflecting the actions of past white historians.
No, I hear you. There is no easy answer for that, but the fact that you're raising the question means that you're willing to do the work of reading, understanding the histories, understanding the culture, getting the language. And I can use myself as an example when I talk about learning about Aksumite sources and ancient Ethiopia, right? It means I have to deal with the Ethiopians who are right in Washington, D.C. You know, anybody can become the outsider looking in. And so what do? I build genuine relationships with my Ethiopian colleagues, the Orthodox priests. I invite them to come and speak in my classes. I take my students who are in my early Ethiopian Christianity course to an Orthodox worship service. We have dialogue, we eat food together. So there has to be an intentional and honest willingness to engage the culture, not just to study it, you know, in that anthropology type model, but to really get in there and live it and engage it and know when I'm not going to be the one speaking, right? I'm going to be doing some work over the next year or so. And I'm intentionally pulling in my Ethiopian colleagues from Addis Ababa who don't have the resources we have in Canada and the US. So they will be the ones, or we can co-teach a class together. See, there are different models and different ways of doing this. So even in my own travels, when I go to Ethiopia, I've spent time learning Amharic so I can actually converse when I'm over in the particular country. So, you know, I can't give a full answer to that question, but the fact that you're raising the question means you're willing to do the work, and just take your time with that and call on who you need to be in conversation with you as you keep moving with this. You're welcome. I see your thank you in the chat. Yeah, yep, yep. So, wow, this has been a phenomenal experience for me. The preparation was different. You know, I've talked about symbolic Blackness before, and most of this material, you know, is what I do. But we're in a special moment right now, and it's not business as usual. So I had to take account of what I've been living with over this past year, past couple years. But this past year in particular has just been unreal. And so just know that even if you have your stock scholarship that you do, it's still open. It's an open canon. My canon has been opened now by these images, these names, the teens who won't get to live into their 20s and 30s. It's the work we're called to do. And I am so honored to be able to share this evening with you all as you're exploring religious life and public engagement, how to take it out into the public square. That's where we need to go with what we do as scholars. And so thank you so much to Shauna Delansky and Kim Stratton. Yes, Johannes Wolfer, Emma Fraser. And I see my colleague has raised a question, I think Esther Akalast.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, yeah. And so I'm just so grateful all of you who have been able to come out tonight. And I'm hoping that we can just find a way to keep this dialogue going in our own pockets of our locales, right? And technology makes that a lot easier too. So a little bit better than email, but it's still kind of one-sided. So, you know, I don't get to see enough faces, but we're getting the information out there. So thank you so much to all the sponsors of this lecture and this lecture series. Thank you.
I'd like to ask everyone to join me again virtually in thanking you again for the energy that came before and that you carried through. You kept us all going. I have nothing to say but wow, and thank you.